Because of the belief in authority, agents of government are imagined to have the right to use force not only in situations where everyone would have such a right, but in other situations as well, such as using force to collect taxes. It stands to reason that if everyone has the right to use good force, but the law supposedly authorizes agents of government to use force in other situations as well, then the law is nothing but an attempt to legitimize bad force. In short, authority is permission to commit evil, to do things that would be recognized as immoral and unjustified if anyone else did them. Obviously, neither the enthusiastic voter who proudly posts a campaign sign in his yard, nor the well-intentioned citizen who runs for office, understands this fact. If they did, they would understand that democracy is nothing more than majority-approved immoral violence, and cannot possibly fix society or be a tool for freedom or justice. Despite the mythology which claims that a person's vote is his voice, and the right to vote is what makes people free, the truth is that all democracy does is legitimize aggression and unjustified violence. The logic of this is so simple and obvious that an enormous amount of propaganda is needed in order to train people not to see it. If everyone has the right to use inherently righteous force, and government agents are allowed to use force in other situations as well, then, by its very nature, what government adds to society is immoral violence.
Let us consider these two matters, voting and tax-paying, separately. And first, of voting. All the voting that has ever taken place under the Constitution has been of such a kind that it not only did not pledge the whole people to support the Constitution, but it did not even pledge any one of them to do so, as the following considerations show. 1. In the very nature of things, the act of voting could bind nobody but the actual voters. But owing to the property qualifications required, it is probable that during the first 20 or 30 years under the Constitution, not more than 1/10, 15th, or perhaps 20th of the whole population, black and white, men, women, and minors, were permitted to vote. Consequently, so far as voting was concerned, not more than 1/10, 15th, or 20th of those then existing could have incurred any obligation to support the Constitution. At the present time, it is probable that not more than 1/6 of the whole population are permitted to vote. Consequently, so far as voting is concerned, the other 5/6 can have given no pledge that they will support the Constitution. 2. Of the 1/6 that are permitted to vote, probably not more than 2/3, about 1/9 of the whole population, have usually voted. Many never vote at all. Many vote only once in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years in periods of great excitement. No one, by voting, can be said to pledge himself for any longer period than that for which he votes. If, for example, I vote for an officer who is to hold his office for only a year, I cannot be said to have thereby pledged myself to support the government beyond that term. Therefore, on the ground of actual voting, it probably cannot be said that more than 1/9 or 1/8 of the whole population are usually under any pledge to support the Constitution.
Though democracy is often praised as the height of civilization, cooperation, and getting along, it is the exact opposite. Voting is an act of aggression, and loving democracy amounts to loving widespread violence and constant conflict. Political elections are not about togetherness, unity, or tolerance. They are about arguing over how everyone should be forced to behave and what everyone should be forced to financially support, via the control machine called government. The abundance of campaign signs littering lawns prior to every election are not the sign of an enlightened, free society. They are the sign of a mentally and physically enslaved society, bickering over which slave master they want holding the whip.
3. It cannot be said that by voting a man pledges himself to support the Constitution, unless the act of voting be a perfectly voluntary one on his part. Yet the act of voting cannot properly be called a voluntary one on the part of any very large number of those who do vote. It is rather a measure of necessity, imposed upon them by others than of one of their own choosing. On this point I repeat what was said in a former number, that is, in truth, the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having even been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights under the peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he use the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave, and he has no other alternative than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man attempts to take the lives of his opponents, it is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing. Neither in contests with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet, because as his only chance of self-preservation a man uses a ballot, is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up all his natural rights as a stake against those of others to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers. On the contrary, it is to be considered that in an exigency into which he had been forced by others, and in which no other means of self-defense offered, he, as a matter of necessity, used the only one that was left to him. Doubtless the most miserable of men under the most oppressive government in the world, if allowed the ballot, would use it if they could see any chance of thereby ameliorating their condition. But it would not, therefore, be a legitimate inference that the government itself that crushes them was one which they had voluntarily set up or even consented to. Therefore, a man's voting under the Constitution of the United States is not to be taken as evidence that he ever freely assented to the Constitution, even for the time being. Consequently, we have no proof that any very large portion even of the actual voters of the United States ever really and voluntarily consented to the Constitution, even for the time being. Nor can we ever have such proof until every man is left perfectly free to consent or not, without thereby subjecting himself or his property to be disturbed or injured by others. As we can have no legal knowledge as to who votes from choice and who from the necessity thus forced upon him, we can have no legal knowledge as to any particular individual that he voted from choice, or consequently that by voting he consented or pledged himself to support the government. Legally speaking, therefore, the act of voting utterly fails to pledge any one of them to support the government. It utterly fails to prove that the government rests upon the voluntary support of anybody. On general principles of law and reason, it cannot be said that the government has any voluntary supporters at all, until it can be distinctly shown who its voluntary supporters are.
Every single person who votes, Democrat, Republican, or third party, is attempting to put people into power who will carry out large-scale extortion, taxation, to fund various government programs. Any candidate who would suggest doing away with all such robbery entirely, repealing all taxes, would be ridiculed as an extremist kook. All voters attempt to empower a gang that they know will commit mass robbery, yet none of those voters accept any responsibility for doing so. They know what their candidate will do if put into power. They know what the consequences will be to any who then disobey the commands of those politicians. But the belief in authority makes the voters psychologically incapable of recognizing that what they are doing is advocating widespread violence.
4. As taxation is made compulsory on all, whether they vote or not, a large proportion of those who vote no doubt do so to prevent their own money being used against themselves, when in fact they would have gladly abstained from voting if they could thereby have saved themselves from taxation alone, to say nothing of being saved from all the other usurpations and tyrannies of the government. To take a man's property without his consent, and then to infer his consent because he attempts by voting to prevent that property from being used to his injury, is a very insufficient proof of his consent to support the Constitution. It is, in fact, no proof at all. And as we can have no legal knowledge as to who the particular individuals are, if there are any, who are willing to be taxed for the sake of voting, we can have no legal knowledge that any particular individual consents to being taxed for the sake of voting, or consequently consents to support the Constitution. 5. At nearly all elections, votes are given for various candidates for the same office. Those who vote for the unsuccessful candidates cannot properly be said to have voted to sustain the Constitution. They may, with more reason, be supposed to have voted not to support the Constitution, but specially to prevent the tyranny which they anticipate the successful candidate intends to practice upon them under color of the Constitution, and therefore may reasonably be supposed to have voted against the Constitution itself. This supposition is the more reasonable, inasmuch as voting is the only mode allowed to them of expressing their dissent to the Constitution. 6. Many votes are usually given for candidates who have no prospect of success. Those who give such votes may reasonably be supposed to have voted as they did, with a special intention not to support, but to obstruct the execution of the Constitution, and therefore against the Constitution itself. 7. As all the different votes are given secretly, by secret ballot, there is no legal means of knowing, from the votes themselves, who votes for and who against the Constitution. Therefore, voting affords no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution. And where there can be no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution, it cannot legally be said that anybody supports it. It is clearly impossible to have any legal proof of the intentions of large numbers of men, where there can be no legal proof of the intentions of any particular one of them. 8. There being no legal proof of any man's intentions in voting, we can only conjecture them. As a conjecture, it is probable that a very large proportion of those who vote do so on this principle, that is, that if by voting they could but get the government into their own hands, or that of their friends, and use its powers against their opponents, they would then willingly support the Constitution. But if their opponents are to have the power and use it against them, then they would not willingly support the Constitution. In short, men's voluntary support of the Constitution is doubtless, in most cases, wholly contingent upon the question whether by means of the Constitution they can make themselves masters or are to be made slaves. Such contingent consent as that is, in law and reason, no consent at all. 9. As everybody who supports the Constitution by voting, if there are any such, does so secretly by secret ballot, and in way to avoid all personal responsibility for the act of its agents or representatives, it cannot legally or reasonably be said that anybody at all supports the Constitution by voting. No man can reasonably or legally be said to do such a thing as to assent to or support the Constitution, unless he does it openly and in a way to make himself personally responsible for the acts of his agents, so long as they act within the limits of the power he delegates to them. 10. As all voting is secret by secret ballot, and as all secret governments are necessarily only secret bands of robbers, tyrants, and murderers, the general fact that our government is practically carried on by means of such voting only proves that there is among us a secret band of robbers, tyrants, and murderers, whose purpose is to rob, enslave, and so far as necessary to accomplish their purposes, murder the rest of the people. The simple fact of the existence of such a band does nothing towards proving that the people of the United States, or any one of them, voluntarily supports the Constitution.
Interestingly, even those who talk about representative government refuse to accept any personal responsibility for actions taken by those for whom they voted. If their candidate of choice enacts a harmful law, or raises taxes, or wages war, the voters never feel the same guilt or shame they would feel if they themselves had personally done such things, or hired or instructed someone else to do such things. This fact demonstrates that even the most enthusiastic voters do not actually believe the rhetoric about representative government, and do not view politicians as their representatives. The terminology does not match reality, and the only purpose for the rhetoric is to obfuscate the fact that the relationship between every government and its subjects is the same as the relationship between a master and a slave. One master may whip his slaves less severely than another. One master may allow his slaves to keep more of what they produce. One master may take better care of his slaves, but none of that changes the basic underlying nature of the master-slave relationship. The one with the right to rule is the master. The one with the obligation to obey is the slave. And that is true even when people choose to describe the situation using inaccurate rhetoric and deceptive euphemisms, such as representative government, consent of the governed, and will of the people.
The Constitution itself, then, being of no authority, on what authority does our government practically rest? On what ground can those who pretend to administer it claim the right to seize men's property, to restrain them of their natural liberty of action, industry, and trade, and to kill all who deny their authority to dispose of men's property, liberties, and lives at their pleasure or discretion? The most they can say in answer to this question is that some half, 2/3, or 3/4 of the male adults of the country have a tacit understanding that they will maintain a government under the Constitution, that they will select by ballot the persons to administer it, and that those persons who may receive a majority or a plurality of their ballots shall act as their representatives and administer the Constitution in their name and by their authority. But this tacit understanding, admitting it to exist, cannot at all justify the conclusion drawn from it. A tacit understanding between A, B, and C that they will by ballot depute D as their agent to deprive me of my property, liberty, or life, cannot at all authorize D to do so. He is nonetheless a robber, tyrant, and murderer because he claims to act as their agent than he would be if he avowedly acted on his own responsibility alone. Neither am I bound to recognize him as their agent, nor can he legitimately claim to be their agent when he brings no written authority from them accrediting him as such. I am under no obligation to take his word as to who his principles may be, or whether he has any. Bringing no credentials, I have a right to say he has no such authority even as he claims to have, and that he is therefore intending to rob, enslave, or murder me on his own account. This tacit understanding, therefore, among the voters of the country, amounts to nothing as an authority to their agents. Neither do the ballots by which they select their agents avail any more than does their tacit understanding, for their ballots are given in secret, and therefore in a way to avoid any personal responsibility for the acts of their agents.
The average person believes that government has the right to do things that the average individual does not have the right to do. The obvious question is, how and from whom did those in government acquire such rights? For example, whether you call it theft or taxation, how did those in government acquire the right to forcibly take property from those who have earned it? No voter has such a right. So how could voters possibly have given such a right to politicians? Today, all statism is based entirely upon the assumption that people can delegate rights they don't have. Even the U.S. Constitution pretended to give Congress the right to tax and regulate certain things, though the authors of the Constitution had no such right themselves, and so could not possibly have given such a right to anyone else. Because each person has the right to rule himself, as schizophrenic as that idea may be, he can, at least in theory, authorize someone else to do it. But a right he does not possess, and therefore cannot delegate to anyone else, is the right to rule someone else. And if government ruled only those individuals who had each willingly delegated their right to rule themselves, it would not be government. And the number of people involved does not affect the logic. To claim that a majority can bestow upon someone a right which none of the individuals in that majority possess is just as irrational as claiming that 3 people, none of whom has a car or money to buy a car, can give a car to someone else. To put it in the simplest terms, you can't give someone something you don't have. And that simple truth, all by itself, rules out all government. Because if those in government only have those rights possessed by those who elected them, then government loses the one ingredient that makes it government, the right to rule others, authority. If it has the same rights and powers as everyone else, there is no reason to call it government. If the politicians have no more rights than you have, all of their demands and commands, all of their political rituals, law books, courts, and so on, amount to nothing more than symptoms of a profound delusional psychosis. Nothing they do can have any legitimacy, any more than if you do the same things on your own, unless they somehow acquired the rights that you don't have, and that is impossible, since no one on earth and no group of people on earth could possibly have given them such superhuman rights. No political ritual can alter morality. No election can make an evil act into a good act.
If any number of men, many or few, claim the right to govern the people of this country, let them make and sign an open compact with each other to do so. Let them thus make themselves individually known to those whom they propose to govern, and let them thus openly take the legitimate responsibility of their acts. How many of those who now support the Constitution will ever do this? How many will dare openly proclaim their right to govern, or to take the legitimate responsibility of their acts? Not one.
If it is bad for you to do something, then it is bad for those in government to do it. And if the same morality that applies to you also applies to those in government, if those in public office have no more rights than you do, then government ceases to be government. If judged by the same standards as other mortals are judged, those wearing the label of government are just a gang of thugs, terrorists, thieves, and murderers, and their actions lack any legitimacy or authority. They are nothing but a band of crooks who insist that various documents and rituals have given them the right to be crooks. Sadly, even most of their victims believe them.
No body of men can be said to authorize a man to act as their agent to the injury of a third person, unless they do it in so open and authentic a manner as to make themselves personally responsible for his acts. None of the voters in this country appoint their political agents in any open, authentic manner, or in any manner to make themselves responsible for their acts. Therefore, these pretended agents cannot legitimately claim to be really agents. Somebody must be responsible for the acts of these pretended agents, and if they cannot show any open and authentic credentials from their principles, they cannot, in law or reason, be said to have any principles. The maxim applies here that what does not appear does not exist. If they can show no principles, they have none. But even these pretended agents do not themselves know who their pretended principles are. These latter act in secret, for acting by secret ballot is acting in secret as much as if they were to meet in secret conclave in the darkness of night, and they are personally as much unknown to the agents they select as they are to others. No pretended agent, therefore, can ever know by whose ballots he is selected, or consequently who his real principles are. Not knowing who his principles are, he has no right to say that he has any. He can, at most, say only that he is the agent of a secret band of robbers and murderers, who are bound by that faith which prevails among confederates in crime to stand by him if his acts done in their name shall be resisted.
While most people probably imagine themselves to be spectators when it comes to authoritarian oppression and injustice, in truth, nearly everyone is actually an advocate of government violence, in one form or another. Anyone who votes, regardless of the candidate, or even verbally supports some policy or program of the government, is condoning the initiation of violence against his neighbors, even if he does not recognize it as such. This is because law is not about friendly suggestions or polite requests. Every so-called law enacted by politicians is a command backed by the threat of violence against those who do not obey. As George Washington put it, government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force.
Men honestly engaged in attempting to establish justice in the world have no occasion thus to act in secret, or to appoint agents to do acts for which they, the principals, are not willing to be responsible. The secret ballot makes a secret government, and a secret government is a secret band of robbers and murderers. Open despotism is better than this. The single despot stands in the face of all men and says, "I am the state. My will is law. I am your master. I take the responsibility of my acts. The only arbiter I acknowledge is the sword. If anyone denies my right, let him try conclusions with me." But a secret government is little less than a government of assassins. Under it, a man knows not who his tyrants are until they have struck, and perhaps not then. He may guess beforehand as to some of his immediate neighbors, but he really knows nothing. The man to whom he would most naturally fly for protection may prove an enemy when the time of trial comes. This is the kind of government we have, and it is the only one we are likely to have until men are ready to say, "We will consent to no constitution except such a one as we are neither ashamed nor afraid to sign, and we will authorize no government to do anything in our name which we are not willing to be personally responsible for."
In fact, notwithstanding the traditional mythology and rhetoric, no one who believes in government actually wants it to be administered with the so-called consent of the governed. If it were actually done via consent, it would mean that each person's political preferences would be imposed only upon himself, unless others happen to advocate the exact same agenda. Obviously, the goal of the voter is not to compel himself to financially support things he likes, nor is it to control his own choices and behavior. The goal of every voter is always to use the mechanism of government to coerce other people into making certain choices, funding certain things, and behaving in certain ways. Indeed, the individual statist sometimes has a very lax view on his own obligation to obey the myriad of political commands, laws, feeling he is competent to rely on his own common sense and judgment, regardless of the law, while at the same time feeling everyone else needs to be controlled and micromanaged by authority. He believes that he himself is trustworthy and moral, and can make his own decisions, and that the purpose of law is to keep everyone else in line.
What is the motive of the secret ballot? This, and only this. Like other confederates in crime, those who use it are not friends but enemies, and they are afraid to be known and to have their individual doings known even to each other. They can contrive to bring about a sufficient understanding to enable them to act in concert against other persons, but beyond this they have no confidence and no friendship among themselves. In fact, they are engaged quite as much in schemes for plundering each other as in plundering those who are not of them. And it is perfectly well understood among them that the strongest party among them will, in certain contingencies, murder each other by the hundreds of thousands, as they lately did do, to accomplish their purposes against each other. Hence they dare not be known and have their individual doings known even to each other. And this is avowedly the only reason for the ballot. For a secret government, a government by secret bands of robbers and murderers. And we are insane enough to call this liberty. To be a member of this secret band of robbers and murderers is esteemed a privilege and an honor. Without this privilege, a man is considered a slave, but with it, a free man. With it he is considered a free man because he has the same power to secretly, by secret ballot, procure the robbery, enslavement, and murder of another man, and that other man has to procure his robbery, enslavement, and murder. And they call this equal rights.
The degree to which different voters want authority controlling others varies significantly. The constitutionalist wants the federal government to force others to fund only the things specifically designated as federal matters by the U.S. Constitution. Meanwhile, the progressive wants government to force others to fund all sorts of other things, from art to defense, to caring for the poor, to education, to retirement programs, and so on. But while the two types of voters differ in the degree and types of aggression they support, they do not differ in the principle. They have both accepted the premise that authority has the right to forcibly extort money for government functions that are deemed necessary. They differ only in what counts as necessary. In their day-to-day lives, nonviolence is the default type of behavior for most people. While there are occasional physical conflicts, most people go to great lengths to avoid them. Not only by trying not to start a fight, but also to try to defuse tense situations. Even when a fight does occur, both sides usually end up walking away. Each day, billions of people find ways to peacefully coexist, even when they have significantly different viewpoints, beliefs, and attitudes. But that is in their personal lives. When it comes to politics, violence is the default. Every voter, to one extent or another, seeks to have his own views and ideas forcibly inflicted upon everyone else through the mechanism of government. The default is not to let others do their own thing or to try to get along peacefully. The default is to advocate aggression against absolutely everyone by way of the authoritarian coercion called law. There is a mind-bogglingly huge disconnect between what the average person views as civilized behavior on an individual basis and what he views as legitimate and civilized when it comes to the actions of authority. It's difficult to imagine anyone behaving in his personal life the way voters behave when it comes to politics. Such a person would be constantly robbing others, friends and strangers alike, of huge sums of money to fund things that he deemed important, as well as using threats, physical force, and even kidnapping to coerce others into making whatever decisions he thinks would be best, for his victims or for society in general. In short, anyone who has acted in private life the way all statists act in the political arena would be immediately recognized as a thug, a thief, or a lunatic. But doing the exact same thing via government, advocating mass extortion and thuggery, is accepted by most as something that normal, civilized people should do. In fact, they sometimes refer to voting as a duty, as if it's actually immoral not to advocate coercive controlling of one's neighbors. Amazingly and ironically, the only people who do not advocate constant widespread violence and coercion via government, known as voluntarists or anarchists, are usually viewed by the majority as being weird, uncivilized, and dangerous.
For all the reasons that have now been given, voting furnishes no legal evidence as to who the particular individuals are, if there are any, who voluntarily support the Constitution. It therefore furnishes no legal evidence that anybody supports it voluntarily. So far, therefore, as voting is concerned, the Constitution, legally speaking, has no supporters at all. And as a matter of fact, there is not the slightest probability that the Constitution has a single bona fide supporter in the country. That is to say, there is not the slightest probability that there is a single man in the country who both understands what the Constitution really is and sincerely supports it for what it really is. The ostensible supporters of the Constitution, like the ostensible supporters of most other governments, are made up of three classes. That is, 1. Knaves, a numerous and active class, who see in the government an instrument which they can use for their own aggrandizement or wealth. 2. Dupes, a large class, no doubt, each of whom, because he is allowed one voice out of millions in deciding what he may do with his own person and his own property, and because he is permitted to have the same voice in robbing, enslaving, and murdering others, that others have in robbing, enslaving, and murdering himself, is stupid enough to imagine that he is a free man, a sovereign, that this is a free government, a government of equal rights, the best government on earth, and such like absurdities. 3. A class who have some appreciation of the evils of government, but either do not see how to get rid of them, or do not choose to so far sacrifice their private interests as to give themselves seriously and earnestly to the work of making a change. Inasmuch as the Constitution was never signed nor agreed to by anybody as a contract, and therefore never bound anybody, and is now binding upon nobody, and is, moreover, such a one as no people can ever hereafter be expected to consent to, except as they might be forced to do so at the point of a bayonet, it is perhaps of no importance what its true legal meaning as a contract is. Nevertheless, the writer thinks it proper to say that in his opinion the Constitution is no such instrument as it has generally been assumed to be, but that by false interpretations and naked usurpations the government has been made in practice a very widely and almost wholly different thing from what the Constitution itself purports to authorize. He has heretofore written much, and could write much more to prove that such is the truth. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it is either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist.